Good evening. It's good to see everybody tonight on this cold evening. If you would be opening your Bibles to Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19. And last week it was brought to my attention that I had skipped a couple of verses inadvertently, so we're actually going to back up and we'll begin tonight in verse 17. Revelation 19 and verse 17. Byron, would you lead our prayer for us tonight?
Holy Father in heaven, who in hallowed be thy name. Again, grateful unto thee, Holy Father, for the preservation of our lives to this very time. We're thankful, Holy Father, that we can come and study thy word, sing praises unto thee, and offer a prayer to thy holy name. We ask thee to be with us, Holy Father, and study thy word, that we may understand thy word and be able to teach it unto others. Ask thy blessings upon those that are in high places, that this privilege of worshiping thee, the true and living God, without fear of molestation, be with us. Many of our number, Holy Father, and great need of thy healing hand. We thank you for thy blessings. Continue with us, Lord, you and Savior, and Father, in thy word. For we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. In Revelation 19, we see that Rome has fallen, and we're seeing a picture here of the ultimate champion of the Christians, that being Jesus. And you may remember this image that we're seeing here. He's pictured as riding upon a white horse. It describes him as the Word of God, which we know is a designation that was given to him. John sets that forth in the opening verses of his gospel. And so without a doubt, we know that in this image that we see, that this is talking about Jesus. It's not any other entity, because no one else fits this description. But we skipped verses 17 and 18, and like I said, I did that inadvertently. So let's go back and let's look at those verses before we go on into the rest of our lesson tonight. Let's look at these two verses together. And I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowl that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God, that ye may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, both small and great. Now, this is not a very pretty picture that's being set forth in these two verses, because ultimately what we see an angel, and the description that is being set forth here is an angel that is, so to speak, standing before the sun, that is radiating the glory of the sun. But notice that this angel is crying out to the birds of the air. Now, some have tried to look at this and say, well, this is symbolic of something, this description of birds, but it's not. What this is another indication that the enemies of the church have fallen. Because if you look at what the angel says to these birds of the air, the angel says, you know what? There's all of these dead bodies, there's all these dead horses, there's all of this out here. So all of the scavengers are being called to come in and basically clean it all up, to get rid of the indications that this war has taken place. And notice that it says that there were all different kinds of people that had fallen in this battle. It wasn't just the common man. It wasn't just soldiers. Notice that it says that there were kings that lost their life in this. There were captains, which would indicate others that had certain degrees of authority. And so there were a great number of people that lost their life. And of course, this is talking about those who were the Romans, or at least the political allies of the Romans, that lost their life. And so the image that's being set forth is that this angel, we've already been presented this picture of Jesus as being victorious. And if he is being seen as victorious, you may remember we talked last week about the fact that when we initially saw Jesus on this white horse, indicative of purity and victory, that immediately following that, we then saw the red horse, which indicated bloodshed. We saw the black horse, which indicated death. And so we talked about that the church came into establishment and how there was a period there of peace and joy and victory. But then persecution came upon the church. And we see this in this progression. Well, now we see in this image that it's just Jesus. That he is there in victory, indicating that Rome is not going to touch them anymore. There's not going to be any other persecution being handed down. But as I said, the image here is one that is not very pleasant, because the image is essentially a battlefield right after the battle has ended. And probably most of you have seen photographs, I think especially of those that were taken back during the Civil War, where you see the battlefields after the battles have taken place, and you still see the carnage that took place that's left after those battles. Well, that's the image that this is showing. Jesus has come in victory, has brought victory against Rome, and now Rome essentially is dead. Rome is lying in ruins, and ultimately the birds of the air, they're going to be nourished, they're going to be used as a way to purify what has taken place. Verse 19, we talked about this last week, but let's go ahead, let's review this as we continue on. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. We talked about how back in Revelation 16:16 we saw the description of this battle of Armageddon. And we talked about how that ultimately is not talking about the fall of Rome. It's not talking about a battle that's going to happen at the end of time. It's not talking about a battle that's going to take place between the nation of Israel and any other nation on earth. It's talking ultimately about the battle between good and evil, about the battle between God and Satan. And so what this is showing us in this picture, Jesus is there. He's on this horse. He's victorious. He's showing those that this image is being revealed to. Of course, John is seeing it. He's going to deliver this message to the angels of the seven churches. Jesus is victorious. But notice that even though this enemy has been defeated, that there were more there waiting to wage war. The battle of good and evil has not been waged yet, has it? Because we know that Satan is still alive and is still at work. Satan is still tempting mankind. And ultimately, that victory against Satan, it's not going to come until the end of time. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get over into Revelation chapter 20. But ultimately, when it talks about the kings of the earth and their armies gathered up, basically what this is saying is that all of those who have a desire to step in and continue what Rome was doing, to live that sinful lifestyle, so they're still there. This one enemy has been defeated, but others would come. But this battle is one that's going to rage until Jesus comes again, because Satan is going to continue to be active in this world. Okay, questions or comments? 19 is where we left off last week. All right, let's look at 20 and 21. We'll look at these together. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire, burning with brimstone. And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all of the fowls were filled with their flesh. So now, the battle of Armageddon has been fought. That's what we're seeing here. Notice it says the beast. We talked about the beast being indicative of the Roman emperor. The false prophet was this Roman concilia, this Jewish council that would impose the worship of the emperor by force. Notice it says that they were taken and they were cast into a lake of fire. Now let me ask you this. Does that mean that happened when Rome fell? That the emperor who was in force at that time and those that were a part of that concilia, that God took them at that very moment and cast them into hell? No. So we see in this is talking about what is going to happen when Jesus comes again. Rome has already fallen. We've already seen that take place. We now, as I said, chapter 19 is a transition chapter. We're transitioning from talking about the fall of Rome to talking about the second coming of Christ and ultimate judgment at the end of time. So here, we see that those who were seen as the enemies of Christ, they're going to receive their ultimate punishment. Those that were deceived by them, those that gave in to those sinful lifestyles, they're going to face the same punishment as well. They too are going to be cast into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. Now, whenever we look at a summation of what we've seen in this chapter and really up to this point, history has recorded for us that when Rome began to fall, that it began to fall in a variety of different ways very swiftly. It did not meet its final destruction, if you want to put it that way, until about 200 years later. But we find, as Revelation chapter 1 tells us, that these were things that were shortly to begin. So this destruction was something that was going to happen over time. But when you look at history, we see initially they were weakened by natural disasters. They were weakened by different infirmities that were brought about due to the lifestyles that they were living. This left them vulnerable. And forces from the north and from the east began to come in and slowly whittle away at the Roman Empire. You had the Parthians that came in from the east. You had the Visigoths that came down from the north. And eventually Rome was broken up. They were fighting wars on every front. And they couldn't keep up because the nation had become so weak. But one thing that ultimately brought about the fall of Rome, and this is something that I find very interesting and something that I find very telling. Just about every historian that you read their account of the fall of Rome, just about every one of them say that Rome had the military strength necessary to defeat any of these forces that came up against them. Even though they were weakened, they still had the strongest military on the face of this earth. So what was it that brought about their downfall? Well, one historian, and one that is generally seen as the most eminent historian on the fall of Rome, a man who was a cardinal in the Catholic Church with the last name Gibbons, he went back and he studied much of the documentation from people of that day. And whenever he prepared his work on the fall of the Roman Empire, he cited 5 reasons. 5 things that ultimately brought about the downfall of that nation. First and foremost was the undermining of the dignity of the home. There was no longer a focus upon the family unit. An overwhelming majority of those who were Roman citizens, They engaged in pretty much any type of sexual deviance that you could think of. Many of them practiced homosexuality, and it came to the point where there was no longer any thought for the sanctity of marriage and the home. And so there was a weakening there. The second thing that he said brought about the fall of this nation was that the leaders of that nation continued to impose higher and higher taxes upon the people. But this was something that I found very interesting. He said they were imposing higher and higher taxes upon the people, but guess what they were doing with the tax money? They were turning around and giving it to the citizens that would not work. Well, let's keep going. Let's keep going. Folks, it's pretty sobering whenever we look at this. And this is not something that's been written within the last 5 or 6 years. This is something that was written about 300 or 400 years ago, before the United States even came into existence. Number 3, he found that the people developed what he described as a mad craze for pleasure. They were willing to engage in or resort to whatever was necessary in order for them to find pleasure. One of the main things that developed during this time was they found great pleasure in, I guess you would say, the barbarous tactics of their military. We've all heard the stories about how Christians would be taken into the Colosseum and would be forced to fight against gladiators or against wild animals. You know why that was done? It wasn't to kill Christians, but it was for the pleasure of the audience. And it got to where the more vicious these attacks were, the more the people enjoyed it. Number 4, they focused upon spending a great deal of money on building up a great military, but something that they failed to focus upon in that was they did not develop a strong civic pride. You know, we talk a lot about being proud to be an American. A lot of times you see those who have served in the military, and I know we have some here tonight that have served in the military. If you did not have pride in this nation, would you have fulfilled those duties the way that you did as a veteran or as a soldier? Probably not. And so what it came down to, you had Rome, who was spending all this money developing soldiers, developing their military, but when it came down to it, the soldiers didn't care if they won or not. They didn't care about fighting. They didn't care about Rome. There was no pride in their nation. And then number 5, there was the decay and persecution of religion. So 5 things that ultimately brought about the fall of Rome. Well, God eventually used the enemies of Rome as well as her own allies. Remember, we talked about the fact that there would be some of those that they felt that they could count on and depend upon to come to their aid that would actually turn against them. So God was going to use them to bring about judgment on that nation. But we look also at some parallels. We go back to the book of Daniel, and we look at some of the things that talk about the fall of the nation of Babylon. And it's always been amazing to me the similarities between what took place just prior to the fall of Babylon and what took place just prior to the fall of Rome. They were engaging in essentially the same things. And God used the same tactics, used their enemies as well as their allies to ultimately bring about their defeat. And this is why we see in the book of Revelation Rome being described as Babylon sometimes, because there were so many similarities there between these two nations. So when chapter 19 ends, Battle of Armageddon's over. God has won. Jesus is the victor. Sin is defeated. All enemies of the Christians have been defeated. In the end, Christianity is going to prevail. Now, if we wanted to, we could end our study right there. Because ultimately, that is the end of the story for the main part of the book of Revelation. But we have some other chapters that are some of my favorite passages of Scripture. Because it gives us a picture. Something that we can look at and imagine of what heaven's going to be like. Jesus has come. What we're going to see in the opening verses of Revelation chapter 20 is what's going to happen to Satan. We've already seen a little foretaste of that. He's going to be cast along with all of those that served his will, going to be cast into this lake of fire. But also, whenever we look at Revelation chapter 20, we begin to see some of the misunderstandings that are in the world around us today. Especially those that surround this idea of premillennialism, that there's going to be a 1,000-year reign, that Satan is going to be bound for a time, that ultimately there's going to be a period of time where no temptation is going to take place on earth. It's going to be a time of complete world peace. And then Satan's going to be released again after time for a last-ditch effort to try to win as many people to his side as he can. Well, they get that from Revelation chapter 20. But let's begin. Let's look at the first 3 verses. John says, "And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand." Now, something to keep in mind. What did I say at the end of chapter 19? The second coming of Christ has already happened. Satan has already been defeated. So now we have a continuation, a continuation in that same timeline. Jesus has come. Well, what's going to happen next? John says, "I saw an angel come down from heaven, and this angel has a chain. He has a key to the bottomless pit," or as some translations say, the abyss. "And he laid hold," verse 2, "on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Now, if we were going to take the book of Revelation completely literal, then we would have to say this passage says that Satan is going to be bound for 1,000 years, that his influence is going to be bound. He's going to be cast into this bottomless pit where he's going to sit there and just get more and more angry because he can't tempt mankind. Look at verse 3 and then we'll go back and we'll discuss this. "And cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed a little season." So as I said, there are a lot of people in the religious world today that believe that Satan and his influence are going to be bound for a while, but then Satan's going to be turned loose again for a little while. Well, let's talk about this. John sees an angel. This angel is coming down from heaven, indicating that God is the one that has sent the angel to do this. This angel is coming down from heaven. In the hand of the angel is a key. And this key is to the bottomless pit or the abyss. Also, there is a great chain. If we go back to Revelation chapter 9 and verse 1, we read about this bottomless pit or this abyss, depending upon the translation that you're using. And in this passage is where we saw this entity that is described as Abaddon or Apollyon. And we talked about how this is referring to Satan. Well, in that passage, it talks about how Satan opened up the bottomless pit, opened this abyss and released locusts. Well, the locusts we talked about represented Satan ultimately unleashing the fury of the Roman Empire on the church. Satan was the one that motivated them to begin persecuting the church. But then we see that the angel comes along, he seizes the dragon, he seizes Satan, binds him with this chain, casts him into this abyss, shuts it up and seals it. This seal indicating that it's by the authority of God, that God is the one that has done this, and that Satan is not going to be able to break that seal, is not going to be able to get out until, as we see later on, 1,000 years has passed by. Well, what is it that Satan has been doing throughout the book of Revelation that would stop if he has been bound and cast into the bottomless pit? Tempting mankind. Walking about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But also, we see, as Daniel prophesied in Daniel 2 in verse 44, that God oftentimes used the influence of Satan to bring about the demise of certain nations of the earth. It was through the influence of Satan. Folks, do you really think God was the one that made Rome do those 5 things that I shared with you a while ago? No. Something we need to keep in mind, and a lot of people, I think, miss this fact. God never tempts man or causes man to do anything evil. So many times something bad happens and the first thing we want to say is, God, why did you cause this to happen? Or God, why did you let this happen? That is not God. When bad things happen, that is the influence of Satan. Now, something to keep in mind. As we continue down into this chapter, we're going to see that the influence of Satan upon the nations of the earth, it's something that's going to grow as time passes by. But we also need to examine this 1,000 years. As we've noted throughout our study, the numbers that we see in the book of Revelation are very, very seldom literal numbers. Usually they are symbolic of a number of different things. And there is nothing in this text to indicate that this is talking about a literal 1,000-year period of time. You've heard me say before that one of the forms of interpretation or methods of interpretation that we need to keep in mind when we study the book of Revelation is if you have a passage that is filled with symbolic language, things that you know without a shadow of a doubt are symbolic, there's not going to be something that is literal injected right in the middle of something that is symbolic. It just doesn't work that way. It's either all symbolic or it's all literal. Well, in these visions that John is receiving, we see that they are symbolic. Now, notice the text says that after whatever this 1,000-year period of time is, we'll talk about that in a minute, or we might get to it next week if we run out of time. But whatever it is that this 1,000-year period of time is, notice the text says that when whatever this is comes to an end, that Satan's going to be released for a little while. His influence is going to be back. Well, we're going to see a little bit more detail in the next few verses. But I wanted to read something to you, and this is probably where we're going to end tonight because we're just about out of time. There's a New Testament scholar. He's often seen as one of the eminent scholars on the book of Revelation. His name's G.K. Beale. And his argument in regard to the 1,000-year reign goes along with what we've been talking about as being something that is symbolic. And here's what he had to say. He said the events in verses 1 through 3 and verses 4 through 6, they occur during the same period of time, which is referred to as 1,000 years. That this is not a literal chronological number is apparent from number 1, the consistently figurative use of numbers elsewhere in this book, the figurative nature, number 2, of much of the immediate context, chain, abyss, dragon, serpent, locked, sealed, beast. We know that this is all symbolic. The predominantly figurative tone that we see in the entire book. Number 4, the figurative use of 1,000 in the Old Testament. And number 5, the use in Jewish and early Christian writings of 1,000 years as a figure for the eternal blessing of the redeemed. So the overall analysis, as he says, of verses 1 through 6 support a figurative meaning. 1,000 is a third power of 10, and if figurative here might represent a long era and at least would signify an ideal period of time, a period of great blessings. So, we don't really have time tonight to move on into verses 4 through 6, but I want to stop with that point tonight. That this 1,000 years is not, as our premillennial friends believe, a literal period of time. It's not saying that Jesus is going to come again, as we saw in chapter 19, that he's going to rapture away the faithful, and then 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth is going to begin. They say the kingdom will not actually come into establishment until then, that the church is just an afterthought that is here to get us by until Jesus comes again. But then at the end of that 1,000-year period, there's going to be 3.5 years of peace. But then at the end of that 3.5 years, Satan's going to be turned loose from the bottomless pit. During the 1,000-year reign of Christ, it's going to be a time of peace because Satan's going to be bound. But then at the end of that 3.5 years, Satan's going to be turned loose for 3.5 years. And at the end of that 3.5 years, Jesus is going to come again. So there's actually going to be 3 comings of Christ. When he came in the flesh, when he comes again at the time of the rapture, and then when he comes again at the end of this 3.5 year period. At that time, that's when Satan's going to be cast into the lake of fire. There's nothing in the Bible that teaches that. That is a misinterpretation of the book of Revelation. And that's ultimately what we're going to see as we look at the rest of chapter 20. And so I encourage you, if you have an opportunity to, be studying over this chapter because it is one that is quite deep in these areas. And it's one that we will spend a considerable amount of time on. Any questions or comments before we stop tonight? Okay, we'll pick up in chapter 20 and verse 4 next Wednesday night.